Hello, SGD, Sacred Geometry Decoded, and I want to have a look at the pyramids and, well, one of the enduring mysteries in the pyramids, and that's not to do with the construction and the geometry in there, but what's happened later with the pyramid. So this is the northeast corner of a Great Pyramid. There we see the north face, and we're looking at the north face now. There are the surviving casing stones, but what we have is the original entrance up here, and so if you visit the pyramid, when you enter, you don't enter through the original entrance, you enter through here. And this is Al Mamoon's breach, or what's otherwise known as the robber's entrance. And there's a very curious question about that. So if you look at all the other pyramid layouts, so for instance, this is Menkaure pyramid, the smallest of the three. And you can see how the internal shafts and chambers, etc. Khafre pyramid right next to the Great Pyramid, and again we see the same sort of very similar design where the entrance is always on the north side and quite low. This is the Red Pyramid, and this one is a little bit different, so I wanted to include that, where the main shaft entering is a little bit higher up compared to the others. So you see that they're basically starting on ground level or very close to it. But the Red Pyramid does have a higher starting point. Now I'm including that, but whichever pyramid you want to look at, they have basically the same design, where the internals or the chambers that the people would be aiming for are low or even below ground or at ground level. However, the Great Pyramid is unique amongst the pyramids in that we have these internal structures which are quite large in comparison, but also that they're much higher. And that brings us to the question of, so there we see, now we have a close-up of, for instance, a descending passage, the well shaft, the ascending passage where we have the granite plugs that were blocking it and leading into the grand gallery. And so if anyone wanted to go inside and find what they are, this is the area that they're headed for. But there we see the next one. So the original entrance. Zoom in a little bit, and there again we were where the granite plugs were that were blocking the ascending passage up into the upper chambers and the points of interest that anyone would be really looking for. And where this red line is Al Mamoon's breach. So that's the entrance when you visit the pyramid that you go into, that the robber's entrance or Al Mamoon's breach. This tunnel was carved out, was not part of the original design, was carved out later. Now to give a bit of a better idea, so there we see the pyramid and the main chambers, at least those that are known and recognized. And we see it's a little bit off axis to center. So there's the center line running through basically the king's chamber, upper chamber, and the main entrance running off. Now that brings us to Al Mamoon's passage. And that's it there in blue. So he's carved his way in, and then let's move that up a little bit higher. So he's gone off, basically started at the center point, just a slight bit off, and then did the turn, and then he's entered the ascending passage above the granite plugs. So the granite plugs, but okay, that probably should have drawn that, but the Mamoon, and then he's come in just behind the granite plugs. But there with the model you get a bit better idea of the robber's entrance or the Al Mamoon breach and how he got in there. Now there's some interesting questions. So Al Mamoon's breach. Now how did he know it's not a short tunnel. It's quite, there's not these exploratory tunnels all over the place. He seems to have started there, carved in, and got into the pyramids. So here's another illustration where we see the original entrance, and there's the Al Mamoon passage. You can see how he's come in to the ascending passage and gotten behind the granite blocks. So firstly, how did he know to get there, and even if he knew where the ascending passage was to get behind the granite blocks? Interesting questions. But then I think, well, the interesting question is, this is spoken about, but who was Al Mamoon? And this was an important feature. So Abu al-Abbas Abdullah ibn Harim al-Rashid, born 786, died 1833, better known to the world as Al Mamoon. He was the seventh caliph of the Abbasid Caliphate centered in Baghdad. He reigned 1813 to 1833. Now, what's not widely reported is that Al Mamoon had a dream where he spoke to Aristotle. Al Mamoon then expanded what was called the House of Wisdom. So, centered in Baghdad, there was already a library, but at some point, the House of Wisdom was extended basically into an academy, where it would have been the equivalent of the Library of Alexandria at that time. It began with a translation movement where the Caliph was collecting ancient texts from Greek, Roman and Indian traditions that led to algorithms, al-Khwarizmi, all these very famous geometers, mathematicians, alchemists, geographers were centered at the House of Wisdom, and it began with a movement to translate Greek, Roman, Indian, basically any text they could get their hands on, they would accumulate, bring to Baghdad and the House of Wisdom and translate that into Arabic. That House of Wisdom movement very quickly started to improve and extend upon and add new. So algorithm is a development from this very important period in history. Not spoken of very much, but this was a center of scholarly work, science, engineering, which was happening, and it was centered there in Baghdad. And it was Al Mamoon who really generally accepted to be the one who really made it something much more than just a simple collection of books. And that was a translation movement. And of course, he was interested in Greek philosophy. Philosophy is an older term even for science as well, not just a beret-wearing sort of philosophy. And so, great book by this, The House of Wisdom by Jim Al-Khalili. He talks about this, goes through it, some fascinating stuff. But so Al Mamoon and the House of Wisdom, people such as Herodotus, Hieron of Alexandria and his technologies, Strabo and Pliny the Elder, for instance, these were the books being brought to Baghdad and the House of Wisdom, translated into Arabic. We wouldn't have had many of these books if it hadn't been preserved through that time as well. But what I mean is that he had access, and not just he was actively seeking out and translating these older works, such as by Strabo and Pliny the Elder. Also Herodotus, this relates to the Great Pyramid. Now, for instance, Strabo talks about visiting Egypt and talks about the pyramids, and two of these are even numbered among the seven wonders of the world. That's the Khafre and the Great Pyramid. Talks about their giant height, but then he says, high up, approximately midway between the sides, it has a movable stone, and when this is raised up, there is a sloping passage to the vault. So there is a movable stone that is raised to give access to the inside of a pyramid. This is one example of these ancient writers who spoke of not just the pyramid, but that it was the internal passages and travelling inside them, and giving rather nice descriptions of it. Another one by Pliny the Elder in Natural History, Book 36, Chapter 17. You can pause to read this section, but of course you can find it. Now, where is the important part? In the interior of the largest pyramid there is a well, 86 cubits deep, which communicates with the river it is fought. So again, he's describing the internal structures of the pyramid, and even giving a very good description of the well shaft, as it's called. So back to Al Mamoon's breach. Now the official entrance would be there. When Strabo describes it, he says, high up, approximately midway between the sides, it has a movable stone, and when this is raised up, there is a sloping passage to the vault. So there's an illustration of what it could have been like, but what ancient writers described the inside, and that people were going on the inside of the pyramid way back in the Greco-Roman era. And that the main door, had a movable stone which is raised up. This is not just some stone to block Al Mamoon's breach. He's describing now the same thing. So when it gets to, okay, there is evidence that the ancient robbers knew just how far to go to get around the granite plugs. This is from, I think it's Mark Lerner's site. And we could go back as well. There's another. Al Mamoon's breach is 23 feet above the pyramid's base. The original entrance is 56 feet above the basin to the east. It is possible, however, that Al Mamoon's breach in fact already existed and had been made by ancient Egyptians who were familiar with the interior. Well, we can examine that a little bit further, because if we go back to this breach was not described by Strabo. It was not described by Pliny. Again, they're describing same as Herodotus. When Herodotus visited, he says the casing stones were still in existence, and they were smooth, and it was so, just like the surviving casing stones, it was hard to tell where one stone began and another. It was perfectly smooth. All these ancient writers who go there do not describe this big ugly hole that would have been Al Mamoon's breach. They're describing a much better preserved pyramid. So this is pure conjecture, but there is evidence ancient robbers knew how far to go to get around these granite plugs, and let's have a look at that. So here we have the internal structures. So Pliny says, in the interior of the largest pyramid there is a well, 86 cubits deep, which communicates with the river it is fought. Now what's he describing? He's describing the well shaft, which travels down. So what's actually happening, these ancient writers, if ancient robbers were so familiar with the Great Pyramid, they could have accessed it through the door, gone up the well shaft, and got into the Queen's Chamber and the upper chamber and the Grand Gallery. And then on their way out, they could have just broken the plugs, the granite plugs, with techniques such as feather and plug, or feather and shim. Even with the softest copper, you can split a stone in minutes using these techniques. This is a ancient masonry technique still in use now. If you look up feather and plug technique, there's no shortage of masons doing this and just splitting stones in a very short time. Literally on video, you can watch the video of them from beginning to end, split granite like nothing. And that's just a common technique. I'll put some links in the description in regards to the splitting stone technique. So the plugs of the granite plugs there could have been, again, cut away much easier than carving a massive tunnel like would have required by Al Mamoon's breach. Alternatively, so that's Al Mamoon's breach. Now, they could have just made a short tunnel like this to get from behind the granite, even not going through the granite plugs. It's a very short tunnel, and you would have got there and it would have brought you to the door. So there's the questions. These ancient writers, they describe the interior of a pyramid, and since Al Mamoon, the translation movement, the House of Wisdom, had access to these, well, I believe that's how he knew. So if early grave robbers had done this, you can't do this in broad daylight. You can't do it by night, because by torch people would see your torches burning by night, and the sound of it would draw attention. There's no quiet way to do this. This would have been very obvious at the time. So even just then, they could have gone down up the well shaft and then carved a short tunnel back out rather than this very long one. So I would believe that Al Mamoon carved this tunnel, and that it was not earlier grave robbers, because if they were familiar with the internals of a pyramid, they could have done it much easier. And if they made a tunnel like this to get back out, it would have been much more discreet. They wouldn't have been seen. They wouldn't have been heard. So what the interesting thing is, that time of Strabo and Pliny, the pyramids, they're describing the inside of the pyramids. Again, Herodotus and others are talking about the pyramid being open. And yet, in the 9th century, early 9th century, Al Mamoon, he got there, the pyramid was closed. There's a big question. Who closed off the pyramid? Who shut down these doors? So, yeah, at the time, higher up, there was a stone. When raised, there was a sloping passage to the vault. Now, there is not a sloping passage. Al Mamoon's breach runs horizontal, not sloping. And so, yeah, he said that these are the questions, and I think it's more than likely someone has closed off the pyramid at some point in the past between the 1st and 9th century. Anyway, so that's just to have a quick look at the older texts that describe the internals of a pyramid. The casing stones were still there. Both Pliny and Strabo, again, are describing this knowledge had to come from somewhere, and that was probably how Al Mamoon knew to dig directly there and find his passage in.